Good evening, everyone. I think you should all get a prize or something for making it out on this stormy night. So welcome to this very special evening with Sir James MacMillan and his reflections on the spiritual in music. I'm Marlene Epp, the Dean here at the college, and on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at Conrad Grebel University College, I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight. We've been anticipating tonight's lecture and the concert which follows on Sunday with great excitement. We regret the weather conditions, but that's the way it goes, and so thank you for coming out tonight again. Sir James MacMillan will be introduced in a few minutes by Professor Mark Voronin, but I'd like to begin just briefly by situating tonight's lecture in the context of Conrad Grebel's academic and community education offerings. As host to the University of Waterloo's music department, Conrad Grebel brings the spirit and soul of the creative arts to a campus often known mainly for its STEM disciplines. And indeed, in addition to our majors and minors, and I'm talking students, not keys, our music classrooms are full of students majoring in math, computer science, and engineering who seek to bring wholeness to their education. Our music offerings, whether it's the Balinese gamelan, the regular noon-hour concerts, the choirs and instrumental ensembles that perform throughout the year, all bring steam to UW's STEM reputation. Our program explores the edges of music's engagement with humanity in all of its dimensions, including the spiritual. James MacMillan comes to us tonight as the Rodney and Lorna Sawatsky Visiting Scholar for 2016. The Rodney and Lorna Sawatsky Visiting Scholar program has enriched our teaching and community education programs for 12 years now. Since 2004, we have invited to our campus a scholar, artist, or thinker who embodies the gifts and values of both Rodney and Lorna Sawatsky. Rod came to Conrad Grebel in 1974 as a faculty member, followed by terms as academic dean and then president in the early 1990s. Rod had a large intellect and personality, making his mark especially in the areas of Mennonite history, life and thought, and new religious movements. His publications and presentations were provocative and insightful and continue to inform. Lorna was and is a warm and creative host, known for her gifts on the piano and love of music. And I'd like to introduce Lorna, who made it here this evening. Please stand up. We are grateful to the Sawatsky family and their many friends who have made this Visiting Scholar program possible. Just a few announcements. I'd like to invite you all to a reception after this evening's lecture in the upper atrium, just down the hall and up the stairs, or a little further down the hall to an elevator. After hearing the words of our guests tonight, you will no doubt want to hear the music of Sir James MacMillan at a special concert on Sunday, March 6th, 3 p.m. at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Kitchener. Sir James will conduct Choir 21 from Toronto, the University of Waterloo Chamber Choir, and the Grand Philharmonic Choir. Tickets will be available upstairs during the reception. I'd also like to acknowledge Sound Streams from Toronto and the Grand Philharmonic Choir for making these events happen this week and in the weekend coming. I'd also like to acknowledge with deep appreciation the organization of our own Dr. Mark Voronin, Professor of Music here at Conrad Grebel. And at this time, I will invite Dr. Voronin to introduce Sir James MacMillan.
Thank you very much, and good evening, and welcome. I too would like to echo the words of Marlene in thanking you for coming here through storm, thick and thin, especially to Lorna Sawatsky, who came just arriving from California moments ago, I understand. It is my honor to introduce to you Conrad Grebel's 2016 Rod and Lorna Sawatsky Visiting Scholar. Born in Scotland in 1959, our speaker has rapidly established himself as one of the most successful and sought-after international composers and conductors. His music has been performed and broadcast throughout the world. Recent major works include his St. John Passion, co-commissioned by the London Symphony Orchestra, the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and Berlin Radio Choir, and his St. Luke Passion premiered recently by the Netherlands Radio Philharmonic and Choir. His percussion concerto, Veni Veni Emmanuel, has received more than 400 performances. As conductor, he regularly guest conducts the world's leading orchestras and vocal ensembles in programs of contemporary and standard repertoire. James MacMillan's output includes an unusually high proportion of choral works, with his chosen genres and subject matter extending over a wide span from liturgically based sacred music for use in weekly church services to virtuosic writing for multi-voiced professional choirs. His Catholic faith is at the center of his creativity, bringing a deeply spiritual and personal dimension to much of his music, whether by evoking a mood of monastic meditation, reimagining a line of Gregorian plainsong, or leaving the listener with music and words which embody a message of hope and compassion. James MacMillan was made Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire in 2004 and received a knighthood in 2015. Would you please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Sir James MacMillan.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see you all here tonight. I've been looking forward very much to having this conversation with you. And I must thank everyone here associated with the university and the lecture series for inviting me to be your speaker and your guest here this week. I very much look forward to the concert later in the week too. The title of the lecture is annoyingly general, I suppose, at the moment, the spiritual in music. And I should perhaps unpack a little bit of that just before I get into the nitty-gritty of what I want to say to you tonight. The idea of spirituality in music is much discussed. The idea of spirituality in the arts, of course, is a growth subject. There are institutes and academic organizations now devoted to the study of the spirituality in the arts, theology in the arts, and so on. Lovers of music, regardless of their own worldview, whether it be a conventional religious view or not, will speak in meaningful terms about the spirituality of music and how music is the most spiritual of the art forms, and so on. And it can sometimes seem that we're talking about lots of very, very different things at once. So much so that there sometimes is a clash of definitions when we come to discuss the issue of the spiritual in music, spirituality in the arts and so on. And I want to look at a couple of what I think are those conflicting positions tonight. Getting to questions of transcendence, yes, and the darkness and the inexpressible in modern music, but also maybe raising questions about authenticity, mysticism and mystery, and the different approaches that many have had to these issues, from the likes of William Blake, for example, whose work and words are very popular today, and seems to suit something of our age and the zeitgeist of our age, and some of the critics who challenged what William Blake's legacy to us was all about. The other thing I really want to say tonight, as a composer, and certainly the last time I looked a living composer, very much alive, I want to talk about modernity in music, and what seems to me the fact that the idea of the search for the sacred has never really gone away in modern music. And I'll be talking about music of the 20th century as well as the 21st century, and highlighting the fact that many of those great composers, whether it be Schoenberg right through to Messiaen, and even John Cage, and many others associated with the avant-garde, never really gave up on this search for the sacred. And the reason I want to focus on that is I see that as a great encouragement for someone like myself who is also interested in these matters of the spiritual in music. There are certain words associated in the public mind with modernism in the arts and modernism in music in particular. Modern music can sound wild and even savage. Like much in the modern arts, contemporary music can open a door on the dark side of human nature and our thoughts, fears, and experiences. Yet, it is modern music that sparkles and bedazzles as generations of composers fell in love with the new bright instrumental colours and experimental orchestrational vividness. And in spite of the retreat of faith in our society, composers over the last century or so have never given up on this search for the sacred. From Elgar to Messiaen, from Stravinsky to Schmidtke, from Schoenberg to Jonathan Harvey, one constantly hears talk of transcendence, mystery, and vision. In fact, visionary mysticism is so much in vogue in discussion about the arts these days that there are even now conflicting positions and even aesthetical arguments about them. For example, William Blake's visionary mysticism has become popular in our own time. It presaged our new age, and for that reason there has been, from certain quarters, some scepticism about it from other artists, going right back to G.K. Chesterton in 1910 and T.S. Eliot in 1921. Chesterton regarded Blake as a mystic, but in his essay, William Blake, His Art and Times, he gives an account of why he thinks mystics go off base, especially mystics of the modern world who deliberately seek to put clear blue water between themselves and any traditional experience of visionary mysticism bred in the deep seas of Judeo-Christianity. Chesterton suggests that it is this rudderlessness that lacks some of the fundamental values of genuine mysticism. Because Blake trusted and followed no tradition, he invented his own unseen world, leading in timeless Gnostic fashion to obscurity and mystification, some would say. Blake's mysteriousness, in the negative sense, prompted Chesterton to define a true hallmark of visionary mysticism, that it illuminates rather than obscures. He said, "A verbal accident has confused the mystical with the mysterious. Mysticism is generally felt vaguely to be itself vague, a thing of clouds and curtains, of darkness or concealing vapours, of bewildering conspiracies or impenetrable symbols. Some quacks," he goes on, "have indeed dealt in such things, but no true mystic ever loved darkness rather than light. No pure mystic ever loved mere mystery. The mystic does not bring doubts or riddles. The doubts and riddles exist already." And he went on, "The man whose meaning remains mysterious, fails, I think, as a mystic, and Blake did often fail in this way. Our poets have very interesting things to say on these and related matters and their wider context. Seamus Heaney has referred to the big lightening, the emptying out of our religious language. And David Jones saw the English language littered with dying signs and symbols, especially those associated with our Judeo-Christian past. Michael Symonds-Roberts, who's a collaborator of mine in various works, says that, quote, the resultant impoverishment hasn't just affected poets, but readers too. And this has been borne out by the now common struggles of English teachers in schools and universities to provide the biblical and historical literacy necessary to make sense of Milton, Donne, Herbert, Eliot, etc. This, one might say, was the unintended or perhaps intended result of what might be described as the Enlightenment project, which was meant to see off religion, except that hasn't happened. Many sociologists now claim that it is secularism that is in retreat, and a recent report placed the number of atheists worldwide at 3% and falling. In his book of essays, Post-Secular Philosophy, Philip Blond suggests that, quote, secular minds are only now beginning to perceive that all is not as it should be, that what was promised to them, that is, self-liberation through the limitation of the world to human faculties, might after all be a form of self-mutilation. To which Michael Symonds-Roberts adds, the romantic myth of the uncommitted artist, free-spirited and unshackled from the burdens of political, religious or personal commitment, has always been an empty one. To be alive in the world is to have beliefs and commitments, and these extend at some level to politics and theology. But this myth has left us with a terror of the imagination enthralled to a belief. Surely this should limit the scope of the work, may even reduce it to a thin, preconceived outworking of doctrine or argument. But this fear was always unfounded. The counterexamples are obvious, including great 20th century innovators like Eliot, Jones, Auden, Moore, Berriman, Bunting. And there's an equivalent list in the other arts too. Music's list would include Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Messiaen, Poulenc, Gubaidulina, Schnittke, and others. He goes on, the relationship between creative freedom and religious belief is far from limiting. Most of these writers and composers would argue on the contrary that their religious faith was an imaginative liberation. Some, like David Jones, the Welsh poet, have said that this withering of religious faith and the resulting negative reduction of imaginative liberation represents a parching of our culture, a parching of truth and meaning, a drying up of historical associations and resonances, leading to an inability for our culture to hold up valid signs, as Jones put it. Now, the opposite of Jones's valid signs would have to be invalid signs, and there is evidence that T.S. Eliot saw manifestations of these in what he saw as the faulty, incoherent vision of Blake and his Gnostic, romanticised heritage and legacy. Eliot disapproved of Blake's rejection of tradition. He thought that his obsession with inventing a religious worldview, self-consciously at odds with Judeo-Christian roots, was a distraction from the vocation of writing original poetry. Eliot saw a strong framework as the means of avoiding the parching of the poetic flow and as a conduit to a fuller and truer vision. He said this, about Blake's supernatural territories, we cannot help commenting on a certain meanness of culture. They illustrate the crankiness, the eccentricity, which frequently affects writers outside of the Latin traditions, and they are not essential to Blake's inspiration. And he went on. Blake was endowed with a capacity for considerable understanding of human nature, with a remarkable and original sense of language and the music of language, and a gift of hallucinated vision. Had these been controlled, he goes on, by a respect for impersonal reason, for common sense, for the objectivity of science, it would have been better for him. What his genius required, and what it sadly lacked, was a framework of accepted and traditional ideas which would have prevented him from indulging in a philosophy of his own, and concentrated his attentions upon the problems of the poet. Confusion of thought, emotion and vision is what we find in such a work as Also sprach Zarathustra. The concentration resulting from a framework of mythology and theology and philosophy is one of the reasons why Dante is a classic and Blake only a poet of genius. The fault is perhaps not with Blake himself, but with the environment which failed to provide what such a poet needed. And it's to this question of environment that I'd like to turn now, because the very things disparaged by Eliot are the very things held in highest regard by our own culture. And the very framework of theology and tradition held to be an essential grounding for Eliot are the very focus of disdain and rejection by our contemporary prejudices. The musicologist and conductor John Butt wrote about Edward Elgar. Elgar's Catholic upbringing tends to be underplayed in most writings on the composer, but it may nevertheless be one of the most significant sources of his compositional character. Since the composition of the Dream of Gerontius, commentators have fallen over themselves in an attempt to paint Elgar's Catholic faith as weak or insignificant. Even his biographer, Gerald Northrop Moore, wrote this: "It is therefore perhaps inevitable that when he produced the Dream of Gerontius, a setting of a poem by a Roman Catholic cardinal, which explores various tenets of the Catholic faith, people should jump to the conclusion that his Catholicism underlay his whole life, but his faith was never that strong." This anxiety on the part of some has nevertheless been explained recently by the Princeton scholar Charles Edward Maguire, who says, "The popular negating of Elgar's Catholicism, both at his death and today, serves an obvious end. It makes Elgar's music safer, more palatable for a British audience. In essence, it creates an avatar for Elgar as the essentially English composer, beyond the reach of any of the complicating factors of partisan religion." In a Radio 3 essay at BBC Radio 3, is the classical music station, United Kingdom, an essay on Elgar and religion, the pianist Stephen Huff said, "When he decided in 1899 to set Cardinal Newman's The Dream of Gerontius to music, he was taking an enormous risk. It was his first major commission, and his career was all set to take off. So to choose this deeply Catholic text in a country where papists were a suspicious, despised and even ridiculed minority was to quote disaster. Yet he went ahead with total disregard for any possible censure or disfavour. So it's hard to believe that the words had no religious meaning for him at the time, especially as he was aware that his faith was an impediment to his career." If it is true that the Dream of Gerontius is indeed a work of vision, as I believe it to be, then it was a vision burnished with courage, foolhardiness even, and gained singularly through a particularly defined religious tradition and sensibility. This was the kind of framework regarded as vital and necessary by T.S. Eliot when he outlined the conditions required for outstanding visionary art, and which had so eluded or had been so self-consciously rejected by, as he would no doubt put it, lesser seers such as Blake and his romantic self-delusionists. Elgar was to suffer for his courageous vision, as performances of the Dream were banned as inappropriate. There's a word we hear a lot these days. Inappropriate in Gloucester Cathedral for a decade after the premiere, and performances in places like Hereford and Worcester were only permitted with large sections bowdlerised, with much of the objectionable Catholic dimension removed. It is thought by some that the vehemence of the reaction impacted greatly on the composer, even to the extent of him gradually losing his faith over the rest of his life. He may also have been seduced by the fame and praise which came his way in the wake of his more secular instrumental works, which turned him into a national treasure. Indeed, he was to become Britain's official composer, being made a baronet, awarded the Order of Merit, and appointed as Master of the Queen's Music. Proclaimed as quintessentially English, he became a totem of nationalism. Enjoying all that, why go back to the depredations of Catholic martyrdom? But it was from this religion of martyrs and saints that Elgar drew his most unfettered freedom to visualize a work of greatness. The etymology of the word religio is interesting, as it implies a kind of binding. David Jones says, the same root is in ligament, a binding, which supports an organ and assures that organ its freedom of use as part of a body. And it is in this sense that Jones, here uses the word religious. It refers to a binding, a securing. Like the ligament, it secures a freedom to function. The binding makes possible the freedom. Cut the ligament and there is atrophy, corpse rather than corpus. If this is true, then the word religion makes no sense unless we presuppose a freedom of some sort. This implies that supreme visionariness requires religion and theology. Now, there's an interesting and challenging idea. How would that go down in today's fashionable citadels of metropolitan bien-pensant culture? Michael Simmons Roberts explains, there's a popular view, influenced by Romanticism, that only the pure, unfettered imagination can produce the great work. Poets should not be religious or overtly political, or committed to anything much outside the poetry. Poets should be free-wheeling, free-thinking, free spirits, as if that meant anything. David Jones's implication is that the idea of the free-spirited artist is a myth and a delusion. The binding makes possible the freedom and opens the eyes to the vision. Major modernist composers of the last 100 years since were, in different ways, profoundly religious men and women. Stravinsky was as conservative in his religion as he was revolutionary in his musical imagination, with a deep love of his Orthodox roots, as well as the Catholicism he encountered in the West. He set the Psalms, he set the Mass. He was a man of faith. And the other great polar opposite of early modernism, Arnold Schoenberg, was a mystic who reconverted to a practicing Judaism after he left Germany in the 1930s and in the wake of what happened there. And he pondered deeply on the spiritual connections between music and silence. And his later works are full of a Jewish character and Jewish theology, in fact. It's no accident, no surprise to me, that the composer John Cage chose Schoenberg to study with. John Cage, as you know, the American avant-gardist who was a kind of provocation to our culture in many ways and asked deep questions of us as listeners of music. His most famous piece is 4:33, which is 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence. But the original title for that work was Silent Prayer. And in France, of course, Olivier Messiaen was famously Catholic, and every note of his unique contribution to music was shaped by a deep religious conviction and liturgical practice. And the list of composers in recent times showing this high degree of religious resonance is substantial, covering a whole generation of post-Shostakovich modernists from behind the old Iron Curtain, Gorecki from Poland, Arvo Pärt from Estonia, Cancelli from Georgia, Sylvester from the Ukraine, Schnittke, Gubaidulina, Ustavolskaya, all Russians. Again, courageous figures who stood against the prevailing dead-hand orthodoxies of the day and the state atheism of the Soviet Union. And in my country, after Benjamin Britten, have come Jonathan Harvey, John Tavener, and many others. So far from being a spent force, as some would like to maintain, religion has proved to be a vibrant, animating principle in modern music and continues to promise much. It could even be said that any discussion of modernity's mainstream music would be incomplete without a serious reflection on the spiritual values, belief and practice at the work in composers' minds. But these spats between Eliot and Blake, between Chesterton and the New Age, between orthodoxy and majoritarian skepticism, are we looking at different types of transcendence? The search for spirituality seems ubiquitous these days, but in what sense can we call a spirituality made in our own image, to suit our own comforts, to fit our own schedules and agendas, transcendent of anything? Sometimes transcendence has to be fought for, like when Messiaen's music encountered the baffled sneers of its secular, super-rationalist, modernist audience and critics, who eventually won round and saw the full glory of the composer's genius and realised the music is the way it is precisely because of its theology. Like when Elgar composes a huge work which he knows will be unanimously rejected, but he had to face up to an unavoidable spiritual challenge, which for him, and indeed for all of us, will involve cleansing flames of purgatory. When people say they are baffled by what the Dream of Gerontius is all about, but are profoundly moved by the music, the transcendence, the revelation, and the understanding has already begun in their souls. The search for the sacred now it seems as strong today in music as it ever was. Perhaps that search now, as it was with the Dream of Gerontius, as it was with the theological rootedness of Messiaen's masterworks, as it is for any artist who stands out and against the fashions and tastes of the cultural bien-pensant, is the bravest, most radical and counter-cultural vision a creative person can have in the attempt to re-sacralise the world around us. Like many artists, I was inspired by the 1999 letter to artists from John Paul II. The subtitle of this letter fascinates me. It's written, "To all who are passionately dedicated to the search for new epiphanies of beauty, so that through their creative work as artists, they may offer these gifts to the world." In paragraph 10, the late Pope says this, "Even beyond its typically religious expressions, true art has a close affinity with the world of faith, so that even in situations where culture and the church are far apart, art remains a kind of bridge to religious experience, insofar as it seeks the beautiful, the fruit of an imagination which rises above the everyday. Art is by its nature a kind of appeal to mystery. Even when they explore the darkest depths of the soul or the most unsettling aspects of evil, artists give voice in a way to the universal desire for redemption." There are perhaps many who would simply shrug this off as meaningless and irrelevant, and there are some forms of art in modern times where the connections with the numinous are clearly more difficult to discern than with others. But in the case of music, there seems to be a veritable umbilical link with the sacred. Through the centuries, musicians proved themselves to be midwives of faith. In the days of the church, when there was a professional arrangement, if you like, between what composers did and what the church wanted, bringing their gifts to the historic challenge of inspiring the faithful in worship. And even beyond the church, especially nowadays, there's a curiosity about the special and possibly metaphysical nature in the power of music. In his book, Music and the Mind, the psychiatrist Anthony Storr makes some bold claims about what great music can bring to our experience. He suggests that our feelings and emotions are given structure, fluency and order when exposed to the abstract constructs of music. Music, as the deep mathematics of creation and cosmos, connect our overstimulated lives in the modern world with an archetypal sense of order in nature. Music, when it speaks directly and profoundly to the human psyche, can provide a transformative sense to human life in all its corporeal, intellectual and spiritual parameters. Deep in our culture, we have traditions which have felt the truth of this. From Pythagoras to T.S. Eliot, there have been thinkers who knew that a life without an active listening and awareness of serious music is a life diminished. And yet, even in our post-religious, secular society, occasionally even the most agnostic and skeptically inclined music lovers will lapse into spiritual terminology to account for the impact of music on their lives. Many people will still refer to music as the most spiritual of the arts. One hears of lives being transformed by music, of moods and perspectives being altered, of attitudes shifting, and renewed meaning and purposefulness taking root in lives touched by music. The serious, open and active form of listening necessary for classical music, for example, could be said to be analogous to contemplation, meditation, and even prayer in the way that it demands our time. The complex, large-scale forms of serious music unfold their narratives in time with an authority that cannot be hurried. Something of the essence of ourselves is sacrificed to music. Whether we are performers, composers or listeners, we're required to give something up, that is, something of our precious time. Music gives us a glimpse of something beyond the horizons of materialism and even our own contemporary values, and we're forced to ask the fundamental question, what is music? What is music after all? You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't eat it, but its palpable presence always makes itself felt, not just in a physical way, but in ways that reach down into the crevices of the soul. What is music? Is it simply the notes on the page? If so, how can we equate those strange black static symbols with the vivid and sometimes convulsive emotions provoked when the resulting sounds enter our ears, our brains, our bodies, and into our deepest secret selves? Here are 3 clues. The musicologist Julian Johnson, in his book Who Needs Classical Music, suggests that neither the word intellectual or spiritual captures music's essential activity, which he suggests is the projection of that definitively human awareness of being more than the sum of our parts. To which the Scottish Jesuit John MacDade would add, music may be the closest human analogue to the mystery of the direct and effective communication of grace. This suggests that music is a phenomenon connected to the work of God in the way it touches something deep in our souls and releases a divine force. And thirdly, to be entirely ecumenical, I'd like to quote from the one-time Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in a sermon he preached some years ago at the Three Choirs Festival. He summed it up in this way: to listen seriously to music and to perform it are amongst our most potent ways of learning what it is to live with and before God, learning a service that is a perfect freedom. In this obedience of listening and following, we are stretched and deepened, physically challenged as performers, imaginatively as listeners. The time we have renounced, that is the time we have given up, is given back to us as a time in which we have become more human, more real, even when we can't say what we have learned, only that we have changed. Serious music presents a living challenge to the dead hand of things as they are. The boundless vision of composers through the ages points to the realization of ourselves as something greater than we are. This, I think, is why lovers of music refer to it as the most spiritual of the arts. There's another way to see the tradition and practice of shaping art according to religious belief, and that's to see a living culture still in evolution and growth. When we come to analyse the steady and constant search for the sacred in modernity, and especially in the music of the last 100 years or so, we can see that faith has not withered. In music, more than other arts perhaps, there has been a constant stream of composers who were and still are, religious. In different ways, we see a kind of unity at the core to the widespread search for sanctity in the work of Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Messiaen, Cage, Britten, Poulenc, Schnittke, Gubaidulina, Ustvolskaya, Penderecki, Gorecki, Pärt, Cancelli, Taverner, many others. Seen from this perspective, we can see the religious principle as being part of the essence of musical modernity. The search for a spiritual paradigm seems entirely natural, part of a continuum in musical history. To some, this may seem undesirable, but in the wider context of the past and various prevailing modern trends, I do think it's strange. In spite of the willful amnesia of some and the aggressive manoeuvring of others, the religious artist will continue to be an essential part of human flourishing in our brave new world. And some might even say that the bravest position a creative person can take is in the celebration of a timeless spirituality. The resacralizing of our world has been made manifest through the unsung, subliminal and subconscious project of musical modernity. If modernism has also brought in its wake a desecration of the human spirit, we must penetrate the mists of contemporary banality to restore the idea of the sacred, in which our true and fullest freedom resides. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. It is clear that Sir James MacMillan has a way with words, as well as with music. I think he is willing to take some questions or comments from the audience, so please. Why don't you come back to that?
Or we can all go to the pub. If it's there.
Please stand up and speak loudly.
I can appreciate, the sacred and classical. It's one of the only music that I love to listen to, and I appreciate that. Bringing it fast forward past Cage to now, and say contemporary music, how would you frame hip hop and rap music into that? What should I say? That framework of sacred and spirituality.
Hip hop and rap are a bit above my pay grade. In the sense that I'm not really qualified to comment. I know where your question is coming from, though, and a lot of people want to broaden the issue out to touch on many different types of music, not just popular forms, of course, but there are other questions that beg asking, like what about the music of other cultures, for example, non-Western cultures, and we would need more than just one evening to go through all that. I can only just talk for my own experience, which is the world of, well, whatever you want to call it. Classical music is a difficult term because it doesn't really mean anything. It means something very specific and very time-connected. A couple of hundred years ago, we talked about a classical period. Ever since then, there's been other kinds of music. So what terms do we use? Serious music? Does that mean that might be offensive to some? I can think of many kind of serious forms of music. Javanese gamelan was mentioned, Balinese gamelan, jazz and so on. We can't just contain the word seriousness to classical music. Art music, perhaps. It may be that it's an art form that is unique. It has its roots in Europe, of course, but it has spread and is still spreading delightfully, so that it has become a universal language, a gift from Europe, a gift from Judeo-Christian culture, if you like, to the rest of the world. And it's no surprise that it's finding new seedbeds in places like China and Venezuela, South America, where classical
Coming back to the other, because I personally had to do a long, hard workout because I did not like that music whatsoever until I realized that its origins came from combatants. And so instead of guns, they were using words, and it suddenly has taken on this larger meaning. And the second greatest culture that has taken on rap and hip hop happens to be the First Nations and Aboriginal students, and I couldn't quite figure that out. It took a while for me to put that together again. So I'm wondering if we take off the labels, you know, remove the walls, remove the barriers, and start looking at it as that there is these life forms called human beings that happen to be in inner cities and then up the upper north on this planet, and that they themselves have a spirituality. Certainly from the Aboriginal community, there's a spirituality, and that somehow there is this spirituality that's there, but it might not be capital S spirituality, it might be small s spiritual, so rather than religious, it's more the other spiritual. Is that a possibility?
Yes, I mean, it sounds like a great plan to break down the barriers, and yes, I mean, your point.
What I'm doing is what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give it value.
Yeah.
In the same context that you're bringing in, you know, Blake and some of the others.
There's another question.
Go ahead.
Right here.
Thank you very much indeed. I wish you'd gone on longer. It was so engrossing. The point I want to try to get at is accepting that the attempt to find an authentic spiritual expression needs to be grounded and disciplined in some way by a received tradition. It still seems that might be perhaps a necessary condition. I wonder if it's still possible to make a distinction between music which meets those criteria but somehow doesn't speak in the kinds of transformative ways that you suggested. In other words, that to be religious or to be liturgical, for music to be religious, to have a religious or liturgical character is not necessarily to embrace this or to accomplish this transformative or transcendent potential that I think you're talking about. Is there still a useful distinction to be made between spiritually efficacious or powerful music grounded in a tradition, and music which, while religious, somehow doesn't accomplish that? Or how would you understand that? The issue I'm trying to get at.
Yes. So you've observed that some religious music doesn't hit the spot as well. Is that in a spiritual sense.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
Even leaving aside the fact that there's much simply bad religious music, but even leaving that aside, is it useful to your way of thinking to try to make that distinction or not?
I don't think when I talk about this authentic potential visionariness in music, we're not necessarily talking about religious music in the sense that music written for liturgy or even as you suggest from a religious tradition. Some of the composers I mentioned deliberately have been in a search for the sacred that have taken them in strange circular routes, John Cage being one of them. Nevertheless, the fact that such a revolutionary concept as 433 was initially in his mind regarded as a work of contemplation, deep spiritual thought, prayer even, he used the word prayer, points to the potency of rooted spirituality in the work of the most avant-garde modernists. That, some of the great modernist figures like even Stockhausen explored a desire for spiritual uplift and vision. There's a great visionariness about Stockhausen. You could say it had its roots in Blake, of course, but I think my concern about using the word spiritual so much, but never actually pinning down what it means. For someone like me, there's just too many questions about that. So I wanted to look at what the criticisms were at that, I would say, vagueness about the word spiritual. And you do find the criticism, and there are strong criticisms from Eliot and Chesterton and Jones and others, but I find them quite compelling, and they're not criticisms we hear too much of in our modern age, which is so dominated by a kind of New Age Gnosticism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words. I was very impressed with your vision about re-sacralizing the world. But as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? What happens if we are having fewer and fewer people at concerts? So if art music is not being heard, are we really re-sacralizing the world?
Good question. And we've gone through cycles of great anxiety in cultures like ours about the potency and the presence of classical music. People were predicting the demise of classical music way back in the 1930s. Adorno was probably the first that said it's going to die out. He blamed the recording industry at the time. In many ways, the opposite has happened. The recording industry has allowed many people to make encounters with serious music in ways that they wouldn't. My own father, grandfather, example, had recordings of great classical music in their houses, but never went to a classical concert, never got near a classical concert hall for economic more than geographical reasons. So people have been predicting the demise of what we call a kind of reflective music for many decades and generations, but the demise hasn't happened. And there may be something cyclic going on here, and especially, I've mentioned already, this incredible growth of interest in classical music, serious music, where millions and millions of young people are dedicating their lives to learning an instrument, and it does take a lifelong engagement. That's the problem with many. They fall away from classical music because there's so much commitment involved. But when you see millions of Chinese and Japanese students, many of whom come to the West now to study, and they become our best students in the Western conservatoires, we see an incredible growth. I know that there are composers coming out of Korea and Japan and China who are some of the major composers of our time, like Tan Dun and Un Suk Chin, and that wouldn't have happened if this lingua franca of serious music hadn't taken a really profound root in those places. And then when you see what's happening in places like Venezuela, the whole El Sistema project, where young people from very depressed economic backgrounds are deliberately being embraced by visionary people who see the way out of that misery and deprivation as through a love of music. And that system has caught on, it's catching on around the world. And I remain to be optimistic because I've seen these cycles come and go, and I see classical music still as potent and with potential, even in our societies. Maybe there's a dip just now, and I know that we all feel, those of us who love music can sometimes see audiences waning, but then something happens and the audiences go up. I refuse to be pessimistic about it. There was some gentleman here.
Thank you. You've presented a very reassuring view of modern music and spirituality. But I'm wondering, I'm thinking, especially of the tradition that's represented by this institution here, do you see a connection, if any, between modern music, spirituality, and ethics and behavior?
Well, that's another can of worms, isn't it? The mention of popular music earlier is possibly connected to this, because many over the generations, the last few generations, have claimed that various forms of popular music has had detrimental impacts on ethical behaviour, especially of the youth and so on. I don't know if I kind of go along with that or not. And I'd love to say yes, I'd love to say that classical music made you a better person, but if you look at what's happened in Germany, where the Holocaust was perpetrated sometimes by people who really love classical music and who went to concerts, and Richard Heydrich, the architect of the Final Solution, was a very cultured man. He had libraries in his house full of books and full of musical scores, and that's a chilling reminder that even being immersed at the heart of European classical culture wasn't enough to save him and save the Nazis from that terrible descent into hellishness and sin. So it's a complicated factor, which I can only acknowledge.
Maybe we'll take one more question in the basket.
I'd like to express appreciation for your ecumenical mention of the Archbishop of Canterbury. As an Anglican priest, I'm really glad to hear it. One of the things that struck me as you were going through the litany of composers was that a number of them have found a way to blend the spiritual with their expression of faith through writing hymns. And liturgical music, as given expression through hymns, is undergoing some transition. Could you comment about that?
Yes, it's one can of worms after another, isn't it? There's a saying that if you had a choice to, what's the best, who are the most difficult people, terrorists or liturgists? And the answer is, well, at least you can negotiate with terrorists. Having spent some of my life in the world of liturgy, I'm certainly aware of the liturgical wars, not just between denominations, that's an old war now, but inside denominations, where people of the same religious experience fight for a kind of aesthetic control of how the liturgy should be. And I've certainly observed that in the Catholic Church, so much so that I've had to withdraw from it, because I just found it so bitter that people could find music and religion so divisive. But maybe that's just life. I'm a great lover of hymns, and one of the great developments and impacts of Vatican II was that we were able to incorporate lots of hymnody from the Reformed traditions into our own experience, which has been great. And if that was to continue, wonderful. I have a fear sometimes, though, that liturgy, and this is showing my own background and so on, liturgy should be an awe-inspiring thing and very prayerful and near to silence. There's something about liturgy which has a lot of silence in it that I find entirely authentic. And sometimes, maybe this is John Cage again, music as silence. We know that music grows out of silence. Composers, in the silence of their own minds, begin to imagine sound which they bring forth. And perhaps that's the same with the worship of God too, that the nearer we are to silence, near we are to hearing the Word of God, the influence of God in the liturgy. So regardless of denomination, when I go to a liturgical celebration where there's a lot of noise, amplified sound even, and amplified lighting and lots of microphones and so on, I feel that is a detriment to the necessary state of mind that I think one is required to pray. But that's just me. It's not just me.
Maybe we'll end before any more cans are opened up. And thank you for your just profound and insightful thoughts and reminding us something we all know, that the soul is so connected to music. And we can continue conversation and over refreshments upstairs, so please stay for a while. Please join us again and join Sir James MacMillan as conductor on Sunday at 3 p.m. at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. It will be a wonderful concert. Hope to see you there. Thank you, Sir James, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And please stay a while.